The morning sun rose over the dry plains, casting long golden shadows across a land that had forgotten the meaning of mercy. In a small house on the edge of town, a widow sat alone by her window, her hands still rough from years of work that no one remembered. The world outside carried on as if she didn't exist, just another soul swallowed by the dust of the Old West. Today was Mother's Day, though no one had come to remind her. The flowers in her garden had bloomed on their own, untouched, and the table inside held no letters, no visits, no laughter, only silence, and the quiet ache of a woman who had given everything and received nothing in return. Her children, grown and far away, had long forgotten the woman who once stood barefoot in the fields to feed them. They lived in comfort now, in towns she'd never seen, surrounded by things she could never afford. Yet the memories of their laughter still lingered in her home, ghosts of a time when her voice meant something, when her hands were still strong enough to hold them close. The years had taken her husband, her youth, and now, her purpose. She had no one left to wait for, and yet, she still waited, because that's what mothers did. Even when forgotten, they waited. Outside, the wind carried the faint sound of hooves. She didn't rise at first, thinking it was only the echo of passing riders, men heading to town, or perhaps wanderers searching for work. But then came the slow rhythm of steps on the porch, measured and deliberate. The sound of boots meeting old wood. A knock followed, firm but gentle. She froze, her breath caught in her chest. No one had knocked on that door in years. When she opened it, she found a man standing there, a cowboy, quiet and warm by the road. His hat was low, his clothes covered in dust, yet his eyes were calm, steady, and filled with something she hadn't seen in a long time: respect. He held no flowers, no gifts, just a simple box wrapped in twine. For a moment, neither spoke. The air between them was heavy with questions that neither dared to ask. And then, with a voice low as the wind through the canyon, the cowboy said, "Ma'am, I reckon this day shouldn't be spent alone." His words were simple, but they carried the weight of something far greater, something that would change the course of her lonely afternoon. Because in that quiet exchange, under the vast western sky, began a story not of romance, but of redemption. A story that would remind a forgotten woman, and everyone who would one day hear it, that kindness still had a place in a world that had forgotten how to care. The widow stood there in silence, her eyes fixed on the stranger before her. The quiet cowboy didn't rush her, didn't fill the stillness with unnecessary words. He simply waited, hat in hand, his presence steady as the morning light. Something about him felt different. There was no pity in his gaze, no hollow courtesy, just sincerity. After a moment, she stepped aside and nodded for him to enter. The old wooden door creaked open, and the scent of fresh coffee and solitude filled the air. Inside, the house was modest but tidy, every item carefully placed as if order could hold back the loneliness. A single photograph rested on the mantel, a younger version of her, standing beside a husband long buried beneath the red earth outside town. The cowboy's eyes lingered on it for a second, then he turned to her. "You live alone, ma'am?" he asked softly. She nodded. "Been that way for some time now," she replied, her voice rough from years of disuse. The cowboy simply nodded, as though he already understood more than her words revealed. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table, two souls bound by silence. The box he had brought rested between them, its twine frayed and dusty. "I was riding through the ridge when I met your son," he said finally. The widow's breath caught, her fingers tightening around her cup. "My son," she echoed, disbelief flickering across her face. The cowboy nodded. "He asked me to bring this to you. Said he couldn't make the ride himself." He slid the box toward her, his hand calloused from miles of hard trail. For a long moment, she didn't touch it. The weight of her children's neglect hung heavy on her chest, and 1,000 questions filled her mind. Why send something now, after all these years? Why today of all days? Her heart ached, torn between hope and the fear of being disappointed once more. Finally, with trembling fingers, she untied the twine. Inside was a small locket, tarnished by time, but unmistakably hers. She had given it to her son when he was just a boy. Inside, her husband's picture remained, worn but intact. A folded note fell from the box, stained by dust and travel. She opened it slowly. The handwriting was rough, hurried, but the words were clear. I ain't been the son you deserved. Life's taken me far, and I forgot what mattered most. If you're reading this, I hope you can forgive me. I remember now what you taught me, that even the hardest hearts can find their way home. Her eyes blurred with tears. The cowboy watched quietly, his expression unreadable, his hat now resting on the table between them. For the first time in years, the widow's heart stirred, not with anger or sorrow, but with something fragile and unfamiliar: forgiveness. After a long silence, she looked up at the cowboy. Did he seem well?" she asked, her voice breaking like an old fence in the wind. The cowboy hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "He's fighting his own battles," he said finally. "But he wanted you to know he ain't forgotten where he came from." The widow nodded, clutching the locket close to her chest. She could feel the faint warmth of the metal against her skin, as if the memory of her son's touch still lingered there. For the first time in years, she felt seen, not by her children, but by fate itself. The cowboy rose from his chair and walked to the window. Outside, the horizon stretched wide and endless, painted in the deep golds of late afternoon. "He's a good man at heart," the cowboy said quietly. "Sometimes life takes a man down roads he never meant to ride." His tone carried the weight of personal understanding, and for a moment, she wondered what kind of past he carried. There was pain behind his calm, but also peace, the kind that only comes after a long fight with one's own ghosts. The widow poured him another cup of coffee. "You speak like you've lost something yourself," she said gently. He smiled faintly, his eyes distant. "Maybe I have," he replied. "Maybe I'm just trying to help folks find what I couldn't keep." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken stories. In that small kitchen, time seemed to slow. The sound of the clock ticking on the wall echoed like a heartbeat, steady and fragile, reminding them both that life was still moving, even when grief tried to stop it. As the sun dipped lower, shadows lengthened across the floor. The widow placed the locket beside her husband's picture on the mantel. "He used to say men like you don't just pass through," she said softly, glancing toward the cowboy. "He said the quiet ones usually carry the loudest hearts." The cowboy tipped his hat slightly, a trace of humility in his gesture. "Your husband sounds like a wise man." She nodded, her lips curving into the faintest smile. "He was, and I think he would have liked you." The cowboy said nothing more. Instead, he reached for his coat, preparing to leave. "Where will you go?" she asked. He looked toward the horizon, where the last light of day met the edge of the plains. "Wherever I'm needed, I reckon." He stepped toward the door, pausing as the floorboards creaked beneath his boots. Then, in a tone soft as prayer, he said, "You're not forgotten, ma'am. Not by him, and not by the world." The widow stood there as he walked away, his figure swallowed by the setting sun. And for the first time in years, her house didn't feel so empty. It felt alive again, with memory, forgiveness, and the quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, love never truly leaves. It just finds its way home when the time is right. The days that followed were quiet, but not the kind of silence that hurt. It was the kind that healed. The widow moved through her home differently now, with a gentleness she hadn't felt in years. She no longer saw it as a place of abandonment, but as a space still alive with echoes of love. Each morning, she polished the locket the cowboy had brought her and placed it close to her heart before stepping out to tend the small garden by her porch. The roses had begun to bloom again, bright and defiant against the dry wind, much like her spirit. At night, when the wind sang softly through the valley, she would light a lantern by the window, the same way she once did when her children were small. It had become a ritual of faith, a way of saying, "I'm still here." Neighbors noticed the faint glow and began to speak of it in whispers. Some said it was a signal, others said it was hope. In a town where everyone carried their own sorrow, the sight of that warm light in the darkness reminded them that no heart, no matter how forgotten, was beyond redemption. Then, one morning, a familiar sound reached her ears, the slow, rhythmic beat of hooves approaching from the road. Her heart stirred with recognition. She stepped onto the porch, squinting against the sun, and there he was again, the quiet cowboy, his shadow stretching long against the earth. He dismounted with his usual grace, though his clothes were dusty, his face more tired. "Ma'am," he greeted, tipping his hat. "Hope I'm not intruding." She smiled faintly. "You're always welcome here." He handed her a folded letter. "Came across your son again," he said. "He asked me to bring this." Her hands trembled as she took it. The letter was short but full of emotion. Her son spoke of how he'd turned his life around, of how he carried her teachings with him now, and how he hoped to visit before the next spring. "Tell her I'm trying to be the man my father would have wanted," he'd written. The widow pressed the page to her chest, tears glistening in her eyes. The cowboy said nothing, but his faint smile carried warmth, as though the message had brought him peace too. That evening, they sat again on the porch, watching the sky burn orange and gold. "You ride far to bring these letters," she said softly. "What do you get out of it?" The cowboy leaned back, gazing at the horizon. "Some folks fix fences, ma'am. I just fix what's left of hearts." His words lingered, carried away by the wind. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and realized that behind that calm silence lived a man who had known loss so deep it had carved wisdom into his soul. And yet, instead of turning bitter, he'd chosen to heal others. That, she thought, was the truest kind of strength. Weeks turned into months, and the quiet cowboy became a familiar figure around the small town. Folks started calling him the rider who delivers hope, though he never asked for a name. Sometimes he'd help repair fences. Other times he'd share food with a neighbor too proud to ask. But no matter where he went, he always returned to the widow's house at the edge of the plains, drawn to the peace her presence seemed to offer. Between them, words remained few, but in the silence, something sacred grew. One afternoon, he found her in the garden, kneeling beside a patch of wildflowers. She looked up with a gentle smile. "They're stronger than they look," she said, brushing the dirt from her hands. "They grow where nothing else dares to." He nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "Reckon that's true for people too." The widow laughed softly, her eyes glistening with the wisdom of someone who had learned to live with both grief and grace. "You sound more like a preacher than a cowboy," she teased. He grinned faintly. "I've seen too much to preach, ma'am. I just try to keep walking forward." That evening, they shared supper by the fire, the kind of simple meal that tastes better when shared with company. The widow spoke of her late husband, of their struggles and their joys, while the cowboy listened, his expression steady and kind. When she finished, he said quietly, "You did right by your children. The world might have made them forget, but deep down, they remember who taught them to stand tall." His voice carried such conviction that it filled her eyes with tears. For the first time, she believed it, not as a hope, but as truth. As the night deepened, the cowboy rose to leave. "You'll be back?" she asked, trying to sound casual, though her voice trembled slightly. He looked at her, the firelight reflecting in his eyes. "If the road allows it," he said with a soft smile. She nodded, understanding the unspoken meaning behind his words. Men like him didn't belong to one place, but to the journey itself. Still, when he rode off into the moonlit distance, she watched him go with a warmth in her heart that no loneliness could touch. That night, as she lay in bed, she thought of the cowboy and her son, two souls at different ends of the same path. One had lost his way and was finding it again. The other had carried his pain across the plains and turned it into purpose. Somewhere between them, she had found herself healed too. As sleep took her, she smiled softly, her hand resting over the locket on her chest. Outside, the lantern in her window glowed brighter than ever, a beacon of forgiveness and the quiet power of a heart that never stopped waiting. The seasons changed once more, painting the land in shades of gold and crimson. Time, with its quiet persistence, had softened the widow's sorrow into something gentler, like a scar that no longer ached, only reminded her of what she had endured. The cowboy's visits had grown less frequent, but each one carried with it the same steady comfort as before. He would arrive without warning, bringing stories from distant towns and the occasional letter from her son, now working hard to build a life worth writing about. Every visit filled her home with warmth that lingered long after his departure. One evening, as the first snow began to fall, she stood by the window with the lantern burning bright. The cowboy appeared once again, his horse trudging slowly through the frost. He looked colder, wearier than before, his face marked by miles of solitude. She met him at the door before he could even knock. "Come in," she said with a smile that carried both joy and worry. "You look like the winter's been fighting you." He chuckled softly. "It's been a long ride, ma'am, but seeing that light in your window makes it worth every mile." They sat by the fire as the storm raged outside. He told her of a boy he'd helped in another town, a runaway searching for his mother. "He reminded me of your son," he said quietly. "Lost, but still carrying in the hope someone was waiting for him." She listened with tears in her eyes. "That's what mothers do," she whispered. "We wait. Sometimes that's all we can do." Her words settled over the room like a prayer. The cowboy looked into the fire, and for a moment, his expression faltered. She saw it then, the loneliness he carried, the same kind she once knew. When she asked him if he had anyone waiting for him, he hesitated. "Not anymore," he said finally. The road took more than it gave back. She reached across the table and touched his hand, her voice soft but sure. "Then you've been waiting for yourself, cowboy. Maybe it's time to stop riding away and start coming home." The words hung between them, not as a request, but as truth. He didn't answer, but the way his eyes softened said everything she needed to know. That night he stayed. They didn't speak much after that, just sat by the fire, two souls who had carried too many years of silence, finally finding peace in shared quiet. Outside, the snow blanketed the earth, turning the world soft and still. The lantern by the window flickered against the dark, and for the first time, it wasn't a symbol of waiting, it was one of welcome. By the time spring returned, the widow's home no longer felt like a place of solitude. The garden had grown wild with color, the porch repaired, and laughter once again found its way into the air. The cowboy had stayed longer than he ever planned. He still rode out at dawn now and then, following trails that called to him, but he always returned before nightfall, dust and wind in his wake, his horse knowing the way by heart. To the townsfolk, he had become a quiet mystery, the drifter who never settled, except in one place. Together, they tended the ranch that had once belonged to her late husband. She would hum old songs as she cooked, while he fixed fences and mended saddles, his movements slow but purposeful. In the evenings, they would sit outside, watching the sky bleed into gold. Sometimes they spoke of her children, other times of his long, lonely travels. And though neither called it love, it hung between them, gentle, patient, and unspoken, like the hum of the earth beneath their feet. One afternoon, a letter arrived. It was from her son, the same one who had forgotten her years ago. He was coming home. The widow read the words aloud, her voice trembling. "He says he wants to see the house again. Says he wants to thank the man who carried his letters all this way." She turned to the cowboy, her eyes glistening. He smiled, a rare, soft smile that spoke more than any words could. "Reckon I'd like to meet him too," he said. When the day came, the sun rode into the valley, no longer the lost boy he once was. He dismounted, standing before the house that had waited for him all these years. His mother rushed to him, and for the first time in decades, they embraced. No words, no apologies, just forgiveness that spoke through touch. The cowboy watched from the porch, hat in hand, his eyes lowered out of respect. But when the son turned and recognized him, his face broke into a stunned smile. "You," he said, "you're the one who brought my letters." The cowboy nodded quietly. "And she's the one who kept the light burning." As the sun set over the plains, the three of them sat together on that old porch. The mother, her son, and the quiet cowboy who had carried more than letters. He had carried hope. And though the wind still howled across the empty land, inside that small home, everything was still. It was as if the world itself paused to honor a truth as old as the West, that even the most forgotten hearts can find their way home when kindness lights the trail. The days that followed were filled with a warmth the widow had long forgotten. Her son helped mend the fences his father had once built, his laughter echoing through the valley as he worked beside the cowboy. The years of distance and silence between them began to dissolve, replaced by a quiet rhythm of belonging. Every evening, the three shared supper by lamplight, their voices low and steady, as if speaking too loudly might break the fragile beauty of their reunion. The widow often sat back and watched them with tears of gratitude. She saw her late husband in the way her son swung a hammer, in the determined set of his jaw. And she saw in the cowboy something even rarer, a kind of strength that expected no reward, that gave simply because it was right. He never spoke of himself, never took credit for the healing that had taken place. Yet his presence had woven them together like threads of the same worn fabric. One evening, as the light faded and the air cooled, her son turned to the cowboy and asked, "Why'd you do it? Why'd you bring those letters when you didn't have to?" The cowboy thought for a long while before answering. "Because somewhere along the trail, I learned that a man's worth ain't measured by what he keeps, but by what he carries for others." His voice was soft but sure, carrying a truth that sank deep into both their hearts. The widow felt her throat tighten. Those words were something her husband might have said. As summer stretched on, the valley began to bloom once again. The garden thrived under her care, the fields stood tall, and laughter filled the porch at dusk. It was a peace so profound that it felt almost unreal, like a story whispered by the wind. Yet beneath it all, the cowboy knew the road still called his name. He had stayed longer than he ever had anywhere, and though his heart was content, he could feel that same restless pull that had followed him his entire life. One night, beneath a sky strewn with stars, he stood by the fence line and gazed out toward the open plains. The widow joined him quietly, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. "You're thinking about leaving," she said softly. He didn't deny it. "I reckon I am," he murmured. "The trail's still out there. Always will be." She nodded, her eyes glistening but calm. "Just promise me one thing," she said. "Wherever you ride, keep a light in your heart, same way I kept mine in the window." The cowboy looked at her for a long moment, then tipped his hat with a faint smile. "Ma'am, I reckon I'll do just that." He left before dawn, the horizon still painted in soft blues and gray. The widow awoke to the faint echo of hooves fading into the distance, her chest heavy with both pride and sorrow. On the table, she found a single note written in a steady hand. "Thank you for teaching me that even a wanderer can find home. You'll never wait alone again." Beside it lay his old hat, a symbol of a man who had finally laid down his burden. She pressed the note to her heart and wept softly, not out of grief, but gratitude. The sun found her that morning standing on the porch, the sunrise spilling gold across her face. "He's gone?" he asked gently. She nodded. "He's got his road to follow," she said, her voice steady. "But he left a piece of his heart here. I can feel it." Her son placed a hand on her shoulder, and for the first time, she leaned into him fully, not as a mother comforting a child, but as a woman finally receiving the love she had given all her life. Weeks turned into months, and though the cowboy's shadow no longer crossed the valley, his presence lingered. The sun continued to rebuild what time had worn down, keeping his promise to stay close. The widow kept the lantern burning every night, not as a symbol of waiting anymore, but as a tribute to the man who had shown her that kindness could arrive even after years of silence, and that sometimes strangers carry the messages our hearts have longed to hear. One autumn evening, as the first chills swept through the air, a new rider appeared on the ridge. The son stepped onto the porch, narrowing his eyes against the fading light. For a moment, he thought it might be him, but it was another traveler, weary and hungry, seeking shelter for the night. The widow welcomed him in, fed him, and offered him rest. As the stranger sat by the fire, his eyes fell upon the cowboy's hat hanging on the wall. "Who was he?" the traveler asked. She smiled faintly. "A man who showed us that even the quietest hearts can change the world." And so the legend of the quiet cowboy began to spread, not as a tale of heroism or grandeur, but as a story of grace. In saloons and dusty towns, men spoke of him with reverence, calling him the rider who brought peace. Yet for the widow and her son, his memory was not legend, it was life. Every time the wind brushed through the valley or the lantern flickered in the window, they felt him there, reminding them that kindness, once given, never truly leaves. It simply rides on to find the next lonely heart waiting for a knock at the door. The years rolled by like the slow drift of clouds over the plains. The widow grew older, her hands lined and gentle, her eyes deep with the wisdom of time. The house, once so quiet and hollow, now thrummed with life again. Her son had rebuilt the fences, replanted the fields, and married a kind woman who shared his mother's strength. Children's laughter now filled the same rooms where silence once reigned, and in every sound, the widow heard echoes of those who had healed her heart. Still, every evening, she lit the lantern by the window, not out of longing anymore, but out of remembrance. Sometimes, when the children asked about the old hat hanging by the door, the widow would smile softly. That belonged to a man who never stayed long, but somehow never truly left, she'd say. He taught me that not all heroes ride in with noise and thunder. Some arrive quietly, speak gently, and change everything before they disappear into the horizon. The children would listen wide-eyed, imagining a lone cowboy against the vast sunset, his horse carrying him toward distant trails of gold and dust. To them, he became a myth. To her, he remained something far more real, a blessing. Every so often, a traveler would pass through town and mention a man who fit his description, a quiet rider who helped strangers, mended broken things, and spoke of a widow who kept a lantern burning for the lost. The widow would listen in silence, her lips trembling between laughter and tears. "So he's still riding," she'd whisper to herself, her heart swelling with peace. There was comfort in knowing that his kindness had not ended with her doorstep, that it kept moving, carried on the wind, and in the hearts of those he helped along the way. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, the widow sat on her porch wrapped in her shawl, her son beside her. The sky burned red and gold, and for a moment, the wind shifted in that familiar way, soft but certain, carrying with it the faint scent of sage and dust. She closed her eyes and smiled. "He's out there," she murmured. Her son glanced at her, uncertain whether she meant the cowboy or something greater. But in her heart, she knew it was both, the man who had brought light back into her life, and the divine grace that had sent him when she needed it most. That night, before going to bed, she stood by the window one last time and looked out at the valley bathed in moonlight. The lantern glowed steady and warm, and for a fleeting moment, she thought she saw a figure at the edge of the ridge, a man on horseback, still and watching. She didn't move or call out. She just nodded once, as if to say thank you. When she blinked, the ridge was empty, the wind whispering softly through the trees. But the peace in her heart told her everything she needed to know. Some souls don't vanish. They simply ride farther than the eye can see. The widow passed away one quiet spring morning, with sunlight streaming through the window and the lantern still glowing faintly by her bedside. Her family gathered around her, tears and love mingling in equal measure. Beside her rested the locket she'd worn every day since that first knock at her door, and the old cowboy's hat still hung by the entryway, untouched, yet full of meaning. The preacher who spoke at her funeral called her life a light in a hard land. But those who knew her best understood that the light she carried was one that had once been given to her by a man who understood the language of silence and kindness. After her passing, her son kept the lantern burning for one more night. He placed it in the window as she always had, watching it flicker against the endless dark. The wind rose softly, brushing through the fields, and for a brief moment, he swore he heard the distant echo of hooves. It wasn't thunder. It was something gentler, rhythmic, fading slowly into the distance, like a farewell carried by time itself. He smiled through his tears, whispering, he came for her. And with that, he blew out the lantern's flame, knowing it had done its duty. Years later, travelers passing through that same valley still spoke of a strange calm that lingered near the old homestead. They said the nights there were different, softer, as if guarded by unseen hands. Some claimed they'd seen a faint light flickering on the ridge, even though the house had long since been empty. The locals called it the widow's lantern, and they said it shone for those who'd lost their way, guiding them home when the road grew too dark. And somewhere beyond the horizon, where the earth met the sky, the quiet cowboy rode on. His figure was one with the wind, his shadow long and patient, his heart forever carrying the echoes of the woman who had reminded him what peace felt like. He no longer wandered aimlessly. He rode with purpose, his kindness leaving traces wherever he went. For every lost soul he met, every door he knocked upon, was another chance to pass on what she had given him. The belief that love, even when forgotten, can always find its way back home. Under the vast sky of the Old West, their story became something eternal. The widow's house stood empty, yet it was never truly abandoned. The land, the wind, the light, all carried their memory. And for those who passed by and heard the tale, it wasn't just another story. It was a reminder that even in the loneliest corners of the world, a single act of compassion can turn despair into grace. And sometimes, all it takes is a quiet knock at the door. In the end, the story of the widow and the quiet cowboy wasn't about sorrow. It was about rediscovery. A woman once forgotten by her own blood found love again in the most unexpected way, not through romance, but through kindness that crossed silence and time. The cowboy never came to save her. He came to remind her that she had never truly been alone. Through his quiet presence, she remembered the strength of forgiveness, the beauty of faith, and the power that lives in hearts that refuse to stop loving, even after years of pain. Her son's return and the peace that followed were not coincidences. They were proof that love always finds its way back when it's meant to. The letters, the lantern, and that final ride into the horizon were pieces of a larger truth, that the bonds we build in life never fade. They simply travel, through people, through gestures, through memories that outlive us. The widow's home became more than a place of waiting. It became a symbol of what it means to believe, even when the world grows silent. The quiet cowboy story, too, lived on. Some said he never stopped writing, that his shadow still crossed the plains on calm evenings when the sky turned gold. But perhaps his greatest journey wasn't the one he made across the desert. It was the one he sparked in the hearts of those he touched. He carried no riches, no fame, yet his compassion built something eternal. And in a world as harsh and cold as the Old West, that kind of legacy was rarer than gold. Their paths, though different, were guided by the same truth, that even the smallest act of kindness can alter the course of a life. The widow's lantern still burns in spirit, lighting the way for those who feel forgotten. It reminds us that redemption doesn't always come with noise or glory. Sometimes it comes softly, a knock at the door, a few honest words, a simple gesture that heals what time could not. If this story touched you, let it linger in your heart. Share what it made you feel in the comments, because someone out there might need that same light. Subscribe to the channel to keep these timeless stories alive, and leave a like if you believe that no act of kindness is ever wasted. In the vast silence of life, one gentle voice can still make all the difference. And sometimes, that voice comes not with a shout, but with a quiet knock.